April 25th, 1945. A prisoner compound outside Reims, France. The war was nearly over. The spring air carried a cold dampness, mixed with the metallic scent of barbed wire and mud. Inside a makeshift barracks, 3 German Luftwaffe officers sat in silence, their grey uniforms creased and stained from weeks of captivity. The youngest, Hauptmann Ernst Voss, once a proud fighter ace from JG 52, stared blankly at the wall as an American intelligence officer laid a stack of photographs before them. "Take a look," the American said, sliding the top photo forward. Voss hesitated, then leaned closer. It wasn't what he expected, not battle damage or propaganda. It was a factory, row after row of gleaming metal fuselages, B-17 flying fortresses, stretching into the horizon under the glow of floodlights, each one in a different stage of assembly. Thousands of workers, men, women, even teenagers, moved like clockwork along the lines. "Where is this?" one German officer asked in disbelief. "Seattle," the American replied. "One of several." He placed down another photograph, the Douglas plant in Long Beach, California, assembly lines churning out C-47 transports by the hundreds. Then another, North American aviation in Inglewood, where sleek P-51 Mustangs gleamed beneath the ceiling cranes. Then Ford's Willow Run, the largest factory on Earth, where a B-24 Liberator rolled off the line every hour, around the clock. The Germans exchanged glances, their expressions darkened, jaws tightening as the realization set in. Voss spoke softly, almost to himself. "Es sind keine Menschen gegen die wir kämpfen. Es sind Maschinen." It's not men we fight, it's machines. The interpreter translated it aloud, and the American nodded slowly. "That's what we thought you'd say." Outside, a distant rumble of engines echoed across the camp. P-47 Thunderbolts, perhaps, or a formation of Mustangs sweeping overhead. To the defeated pilots, the sound was no longer one of pride or challenge. It was the sound of inevitability, of an enemy that had harnessed the power of an entire continent. For years, the Luftwaffe had ruled the skies, from the Blitz over London to the frozen fields of Russia. But by 1944, the tide had turned. The Americans had achieved what seemed impossible, a relentless wave of production so vast that it buried the German war machine under a sea of aluminum. And the Germans, once so confident in their engineering and discipline, were finally beginning to understand what they were truly up against. January 1942, Detroit, Michigan. Snow whirled outside the vast brick walls of the Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant, still unfinished but already alive with the clang of steel and the hum of welding torches. Inside, Henry Ford's engineers stood shoulder to shoulder with generals from Washington, surveying a blueprint that looked more like a city plan than a factory floor. "Gentlemen," said Edsel Ford, laying a hand across the paper, "this will be the greatest production line in human history. 1 bomber an hour." The officers exchanged skeptical looks. 1 B-24 Liberator per hour. Before Pearl Harbor, America had built fewer than 3,000 planes in an entire year. But Ford's quiet confidence carried the kind of conviction that only industrial titans could wield. Within months, the assembly lines began to roar. Conveyor belts snaked through hangars larger than 20 football fields. Trains rumbled in, carrying aluminum, engines, and endless crates of parts. At full swing, Willow Run employed over 40,000 men and women, machinists, welders, housewives turned riveters, and high school graduates barely old enough to vote. From above, the plant resembled a giant letter L, sprawling across more than 3.5 million square feet. The west end was for engines, the north for wings and fuselages. Every hour, the completed B-24s rolled out onto the Michigan snow, engines thundering, ready for war. Across the nation, the same miracle was unfolding. In Seattle, Boeing's workers hammered together B-17 flying fortresses by the thousands. The flying fortresses that would soon darken the skies over Germany. In Inglewood, California, North American aviation churned out P-51 Mustangs faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them. Meanwhile, on the East Coast, Grumman and Republic were flooding the Navy with F-6F Hellcats and P-47 Thunderbolts. These machines, powerful and fast, became the steel wings of America's expanding air armada. By 1943, the numbers had become almost mythic. 65,000 aircraft in 1 year, 96,000 the next. By 1945, over 300,000 aircraft, an entire sky of aluminum and fury. To fuel this avalanche, America converted everything: automobile plants, shipyards, even typewriter factories. Chrysler built tank engines. General Motors produced propellers. Singer sewing machines made gun sights. No longer were American civilians bystanders. They were soldiers behind the lines, fighting with wrenches instead of rifles. Inside these plants, you could hear the rhythm of war, the hammer of the rivet gun, the shriek of steel pressed into wings. The smell of oil and sweat mixed with the distant strains of swing music blaring from the radio. Posters on the walls read, "The faster you work, the sooner he'll come home." Even the most hardened generals visiting from Europe were stunned. They had seen industrial mobilization before, Germany's relentless production, Japan's precision, but nothing like this. This was not mobilization, it was transformation. By late 1943, America was not just supplying itself, it was feeding the entire Allied world. British bombers flew with American engines. Soviet fighters received US radios. Pilots from Free France and Poland trained in American skies under American wings. And deep beneath this industrial symphony was something even more powerful, a sense of unity. For every fallen airman over Europe, 1,000 new planes stood ready to replace him. For every Luftwaffe victory, a dozen new squadrons rose to answer. Back in Berlin, the German High Command began receiving intelligence reports about this unprecedented scale. At first, they dismissed it as propaganda, but soon the skies themselves proved otherwise. February 20th, 1944, somewhere over Schweinfurt, Germany, the morning sky was white with contrails, hundreds of them. Each twisting streak marked another bomber, another formation, another symbol of American industrial might, made flesh and steel. The Luftwaffe's radar screens flickered wildly. Achtung! Große Formation kommt! Attention! Large formation incoming! Shall echo through every German airbase within 200 miles. Sirens wailed. Pilots sprinted across the snow to their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, engines already howling to life. From the cockpit of his B-17 Liberty Bell, Captain William Grady could see the world below erupt in black bursts of flak. His intercom crackled. "Bandits! 11 o'clock high!" Through his frosted goggles, Grady saw them. A swarm of Bf-109s diving from the sun. But before they could close in, silver streaks cut across the horizon. The P-51 Mustangs. They swooped down with a predatory grace, their Merlin engines screaming, their guns flashing like camera shutters. "Eagles are here! Cover's on the way!" the tail gunner shouted. In that moment, the balance of air power, once tilted toward Germany, shifted forever. The Luftwaffe pilots were brave, skilled, and experienced, but bravery couldn't stop an ocean of steel. For every German fighter that fell, another 100 Allied bombers crossed the Channel. For every airfield destroyed, 2 more sprang up in England. The Americans weren't fighting battles anymore. They were fighting by arithmetic, a war of numbers the Reich could never hope to match. At its peak, the United States was producing 50,000 aircraft a year, more than the entire Axis combined. The skies above Europe became an unbroken chain of formations, B-17s, B-24s, and later P-47s and P-51s flying escort. To the people on the ground in Germany, it seemed endless. Every dawn brought the same sight, the horizon shimmering with silver dots, engines rumbling like a rolling thunderstorm. The bomb bays opened, and the heart of the Reich shook. For the German High Command, it was more than a military crisis. It was psychological. Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, later admitted that by 1944, the Reich had lost the ability to comprehend the sheer scale of American production. Factories that had taken Germany years to construct could be erased in an afternoon. The Luftwaffe's elite, the Jagdgeschwader, were being slaughtered faster than new pilots could be trained. Fuel shortages grew desperate. Some squadrons flew missions with barely enough gasoline to return home. And yet, the bombers kept coming. In the ruins of Hamburg, Berlin, and Munich, civilians whispered a new kind of fear. The endless hum in the distance, the trembling glass, the shadows that grew larger until they covered the sky. Back at the front, German officers began to see the truth that POW Voss would later put into words. They were no longer fighting men, but machines. A war against production, against factories, against a people who could turn raw ore into vengeance. The nightmare of the Luftwaffe had taken shape, not in the skies over Berlin, but in the assembly lines of Detroit, Seattle, and Long Beach. June 1944, Washington, D.C. Rain streaked down the windows of the War Department as General Henry Hap Arnold studied a map peppered with red pins, each marking a new factory, training base, or depot. His aide stood quietly as he spoke, voice calm but urgent. "Gentlemen," Arnold said, tapping the table, "we are fighting not just with men, but with machines. And the machines are winning." By that summer, the United States Army Air Forces had grown to over 2.4 million personnel and more than 80,000 combat aircraft. It was an air armada larger than the entire pre-war armies of many nations. Yet behind every squadron in Europe, Africa, and the Pacific stood a ghost army. Millions of factory workers, engineers, welders, and farmers, each part of the colossal organism known as the arsenal of democracy. Factories ran 24 hours a day. Women took over the forges once dominated by men. African Americans, immigrants, and rural workers who had never left their counties now built planes that flew over continents. Propaganda reels called it America's Second Front, but it was more than that. It was the heartbeat of the war effort. In California, a young woman named Norma Jean Doherty, later known to the world as Marilyn Monroe, sprayed the fuselage of a B-29 bomber. In Buffalo, steelworker John Dillon clocked 12-hour shifts, riveting wing sections for P-38 Lightnings. Across the Midwest, high school girls drove tractors to harvest aluminum scrap. Every nail, every bolt, every spark was part of a single, shared defiance. Back in Europe, American airmen felt it. On briefing mornings in cold English airfields, as crews assembled around their B-17s, the ground crews would point to the polished fuselage and say, "She was born in Kansas, raised in California, and she's coming of age over Germany." For every bomber lost over the Ruhr or the Rhine, another rolled off the line within hours. Some airmen even joked that the planes were being built faster than they could crash. To the Germans, the statistics seemed impossible. By late 1944, American factories were producing 5 fighters for every one the Luftwaffe built, 3 bombers for every month of German output, and nearly 10,000 aircraft engines per week. General Albert Kesselring, one of Hitler's most capable field commanders, admitted in his post-war memoir that the Reich had been crushed not by numbers of soldiers, but by numbers of machines. Meanwhile, Hitler's scientists raced to invent miracle weapons, the V-2 rockets, jet fighters, and guided bombs. But the technological brilliance could not keep up with the logistical nightmare. The Allies didn't need miracles. They had momentum. In a sense, the B-17s and P-51s that dominated the skies weren't just machines of war. They were symbols, flying proof that democracy, when mobilized, could outbuild and outlast any dictatorship. Even at the height of bombing campaigns, American newspapers published stories of new record-breaking production numbers. The message was clear to every citizen: you are building victory, and that victory was measured not in miles, but in machines. Hundreds of thousands of them, gleaming, roaring, and unstoppable. May 1945. Flossenburg Prisoner Compound, Bavaria. The war was ending. The smell of smoke still clung to the mountains as Allied soldiers led a group of captured officers through the wire gates. Among them was a weary Luftwaffe colonel named Kurt Heinze. once commander of a fighter wing during the Battle of Britain. His once proud uniform hung loosely from his frame, the eagle on his cap tarnished and dull. A young American lieutenant escorted him into a wooden hut, where a projector hummed faintly. A film reel began to turn. On the screen, footage rolled in silence. Colour images of vast American factories, endless rows of aircraft, P-51s, B-29s, C-47s, stretching out like wheat fields under fluorescent light. Women guided rivet guns, sparks dancing from metal. Forklifts moved wings the size of houses. A new bomber slid out of the hangar every 63 minutes. Heinze watched without expression at first, but as the film continued, something in his face broke. Not anger, but realization. "This," he muttered, barely audible. "This is how we lost." The lieutenant said nothing. The reel flickered, showing trains loaded with aircraft engines. Convoys of trucks carrying crates marked North American Aviation, Lockheed, Douglas. Then came footage of airfields. Hundreds of bombers taxiing one after another, their propellers chopping the air into thunder. "We thought we were fighting soldiers," Heinze said quietly, almost reverently. "But we were fighting a nation of factories." He turned toward the lieutenant. "You didn't just outfly us, you outbuilt us." Outside, the war's final echoes still rumbled across the continent. Artillery shells in the distance, the last spasms of a dying Reich. But the truth was already written in aluminum and oil, in the roar of 1,000 engines that had carried democracy across oceans. From 1942 to 1945, the United States had built nearly 300,000 aircraft, more than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. It was an achievement so vast that even America's own generals struggled to comprehend it. Factories once making cars, typewriters, and vacuum cleaners had produced a sky full of warbirds. By the time Germany surrendered, Allied air superiority was not just dominance, it was absolute. In the Pacific, swarms of B-29s bombed Japan's industrial heartland, while P-51s, born from the same production miracle, escorted them all the way to Tokyo. The same power that had broken the Luftwaffe now burned over the skies of Asia. Back in Europe, the men who once led Hitler's air force sat in silence, stunned not by defeat in combat, but by the scale of what they had faced. The industrial symphony of democracy had drowned out tyranny. As one German prisoner later told his interrogators, "We were brave, we were disciplined, we were skilled, but you Americans, you had infinity." And somewhere across the Atlantic, the assembly lines slowed, the last rivet guns fell silent, and the factories that had built the wings of victory returned to peace. The engines of war now idle, but their legacy echoing forever across the skies they once ruled.